Rain has all sorts of ways of frustrating the military. Rain conspires with soil to make mud, or with rivers and streams to create flooding. It turns to ice or falls as snow. It seeps into weapons, immobilizing them with rust. It soaks through uniforms, leaving men susceptible to diseases like dysentery or to the hazards of exposure.
Rain has been of the most enormous significance in military history. We just have to think about what rain actually does. We get a combination of rain and lots of men. The surface of the earth is inevitably going to be reduced to mud. But it also has an effect on weapon systems. Early artillery, for example, rain, water, could have the most dreadful effect on gunpowder. It would have misfires. But even modern weapon systems are affected by rain. The flight of a shell, for example, can be severely affected by weather conditions, particularly rain.
By the normal rules of contemporary warfare, the summer fighting season was long over when the army of King Henry V of England faced the forces of France at Agincourt on the 25th of October, 1415. Some 900 men-at-arms and 8,000 archers were cornered and outnumbered by an enemy 30,000 strong. The battleground was only 1,000 yards wide, flanked by ploughed open fields, and behind them, thick woods. There was little room to maneuver, no chance of retreat, and little hope of escape. What was less apparent was that the battleground, a ploughed field, had been thoroughly soaked through by days of rain.
The water vapour, which is everywhere in the atmosphere, is there as an invisible vapour. And in some way, this condenses and eventually becomes large drops of water. In our latitude, this mostly happens through the formation of ice crystals. I mean, little clouds high up on the summer's day, you see cirrus clouds. These are tiny little, rather beautiful crystals often, and they form direct from the vapour onto tiny particles of dust in the atmosphere. And then they grow direct from the vapour stage, a process called deposition. They gradually flutter down, moving rather slowly to start with, mix together and eventually begin to hang together. They've often got rough shapes, and when you get enough of those, they become a snowflake, which falls a bit faster. Then once they fall below the level where the temperature exceeds zero, they melt and you get rain.
Henry had not meant to fight the battle at all. For one thing, his troops were in a pitiful state, decimated by disease, weakened by hunger, and depleted by battle casualties. Some 70 years earlier, Henry's great-grandfather, King Edward III, had set off the 100 Years' War in pursuit of his claim to the throne of France. Henry had embarked on the same quest in August 1415 and scored a remarkable success with the capture of Harfleur after a punishing 6-week siege. The cost, however, had been considerable. The English lost some 3,000 men, a quarter of their strength. By the time Harfleur was over, it was late September, and with summer fast fading, Henry decided to march his remaining forces to Calais, where he planned to embark for England. The march to Calais, some 140 miles northeastwards from Harfleur, was extraordinarily difficult. Torrential rain poured down on men already sick, hungry, and exhausted. As he sought a crossing over the River Somme, Henry found the bridges either destroyed or heavily guarded. Because of the rains, the fords along the way were impassable. Eventually, on the 19th of October, the English came to an undefended crossing at Athis, 10 miles southeast of Péronne. But the French, who had been shadowing them, knew their every move. They took up a blocking position at the castle of Agincourt on the main road that led to Calais and stationed another force at the English rear. The French, understandably enough, believed that they could easily finish off the young English upstart who had dared to claim their throne. After all, they outnumbered the English 3-1, and while they were relatively fresh, the English were in an even worse state than they had been when they set out from Harfleur.
It was a dead cert that the English were going to be defeated. That there was no way that this little English army was actually going to survive. If people were giving odds, they'd have placed odds of perhaps 1,000 to 1. Now, not on Henry V winning, but on Henry V surviving the day.
Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France, is out there, out of season, trying to stop the English army from getting back to Calais. He wants to destroy the English army so that it doesn't come back next year and conduct a chevauchée and destroy his fields and ruin his country. So he wants to stop King Henry getting to Calais. It's raining. So what? His strategic imperative is not keep the guys dry, it's not avoid unpleasantness, it's not stay out of the mud. No, his strategic imperative is stop King Henry getting to Calais.
The Battle of Agincourt opened with a nerve-wracking standoff lasting 3 hours. The eager, impatient French knights were held back as the French commander, the Constable Charles I d'Albret, waited, expecting the hot-headed Henry to make a rash move. Henry let him wait, and when he moved, it was not rashly, but cautiously. Late in the morning of the 25th of October, Henry ordered his army to move forward half a mile. This halved the distance between the French and English armies. In their new position, the English deployed behind a protective palisade of stakes, and on the flanks, longbowmen pushed forward another 100 yards or more, just where the trees met the open ground. The maneuver had the desired effect. The French knights could be controlled no longer, and with great reluctance, d'Albret gave the order to advance.
If you're commanding a medieval army, you can give orders to men-at-arms, to the foot soldiers. But it's going to be very difficult giving orders to enthusiastic young knights who've been drinking all night long and whose blood is up. It's simply not something that you can do in the 15th century. You were dealing with your social equals, in some cases, your social superiors. And so what in later centuries would be orders are really suggestions. And if your knights choose not to take your suggestion, if they say to you, look, this English rabble is in a dreadful mess, just let's go up there and slaughter them, we can have it over and done with by breakfast. What does d'Albret to say? Look, be careful, look, remember what happened at Crécy? No. This is not like Crécy. This is a band of ruffians, a band of brigands, and they are going to be slaughtered.
Like greyhounds leaping from the traps, the knights raced forward towards the English emplacement. But their horses, heavily weighed down by weaponry and armor, quickly broke up the rain-soaked furrows. Before long, the knights were mired in thick, glutinous mud and struggling.
The English are defending at Agincourt. The French have to attack the English. The English, as far as they're concerned, if the battle doesn't happen, if they can wander unmolested up to Calais, they'd be happy. The English don't want to fight. They're defending. And it's the French who have to attack the English. So the English can stand still. And if you're in a muddy, plowed field, ankle deep, knee deep in mud, and this is in near the Somme, where the mud sticks to the mud and your feet become huge and it becomes difficult to move, the English can stand still. The French have to charge. So in this case, the weather, the mud, is helping the defender at Agincourt, just as the mud in the Somme Valley would help the defender hundreds of years later in the First World War. So it is the French who have to fight in the mud. The English just have to stand in the mud.
The French were sitting targets for the English longbowmen, and scores of knights, together with their horses, went down under a torrent of arrows. Those who managed to escape the downpour struggled on to reach the English lines, only to be attacked from the rear by longbowmen wielding swords, hatchets, billhooks, and axes. Within minutes, every Frenchman in the first attack wave was either captured or dead.
They couldn't control the weather. They couldn't make it stop raining. They couldn't create a hard-packed surface for their horses to charge on to allow them to exploit their advantage of cavalry. What's bizarre at Agincourt is that where they finally decide to attack the English is between two woods. So it's not that it's raining and they shouldn't have fought. It's that you're fighting on a narrow battlefield where you can't use your advantage of cavalry. This is a case in which the rain and the squishy condition of the battlefield magnifies other factors, like the fact that the French have chosen to fight in a stupid place.
Though the French attacked twice more, they were repulsed. The hard, humiliating lesson the French learned at Agincourt was the futility of using massed formations against a mobile enemy, and that rain and its effects could be the most formidable enemy of all. At Waterloo in 1815, where the British and the French confronted each other again, the weapons used were very different. But 19th century armies equipped with muskets and cannon were overshadowed by weather as much as their 15th century counterparts. The midsummer date of the Battle of Waterloo, the 18th of June, 1815, seemed propitious for a confrontation that was going to decide the future of Europe for the next 100 years. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, doubtless believed that future would belong to himself and his descendants, until 2 hours of rain completely changed his prospects. In 1814, the British thought that they had finally finished off Napoleon when they and their allies invaded France and forced the emperor to abdicate. Afterwards, Napoleon was imprisoned on the island of Elba, too close, as it soon turned out, to the scenes of his former glory. At the age of 45, the skills that made Napoleon comparable to Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar were still unimpaired, and his ambition burned as strongly as ever. Determined to retrieve all he had lost, he escaped from Elba while the British governor was absent and landed at Cannes in the south of France on the 1st of March, 1815. Back in Paris, Napoleon gathered together a new army totaling in all over 700,000 men. Around 105,000 of them were going to fight under his command at the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon's old enemies had to recover quickly from the shock of seeing their nemesis return in fighting mood, and they began to mass their own forces along the French frontier. However, Napoleon knew that they would not be up to full strength until the middle of July, and he meant to strike first and catch them in disarray. The first and most obvious objective was the Allied force in Belgium. The British, commanded by Field Marshal Sir Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, and the Prussians, under the command of Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. On the 11th of June, 1815, Napoleon left Paris in secret, and 3 days later concentrated his forces near Charleroi. That particular June, however, was ominously wet, with more than the usual amount of rainfall, some of it torrential.
In the latter part of the 18th century and the early 19th century, the best meteorologists in the world were in the Royal Navy. They already understood the relationship between areas of high pressure and low pressure. They understood wind systems. The Royal Navy understood how these wind systems and weather systems were actually going to affect the continent of Europe. The French, like the British, had actually been keeping tables of rainfall ever since really the late 17th century. They understood the implications of barometric pressure, and they could make calculations based on rainfall tables, the season of the year, the direction of the wind, and barometric pressure. So they had a generally reasonable idea of what weather conditions would be on average. They, of course, had no way of predicting specific weather conditions, and this was really something that we were not able to do until the early 20th century.
The Battle of Waterloo was preceded by minor engagements at Ligny, where Napoleon defeated the Prussians, and at the tiny crossroads village of Quatre Bras, where Wellington was held in check. Wellington managed to retreat to defensive positions south of another small village, Waterloo, across the Franco-Belgian border on the 17th of June, when a mighty rainstorm hit the area. The downpour was intense and lasted 2 hours. Conditions were utterly miserable. Lieutenant William Turner of the 13th Hussars wrote to a friend, It was a dreadful rainy night. Every man in the cavalry wet to the skin, and nearly all the infantry as bad. Nothing to eat all day, being without rations. At 4 a.m. on the memorable 18th of June, turned out and formed on the field of battle in wet corn, and a cold morning without anything to eat. Nothing but some gin, which I purchased from a German woman, saved and enabled me and 3 other officers to stand the fatigues of the day. Because of the rain, Napoleon had to postpone his advance on Wellington's positions, planning to resume the next day. On the 18th of June, however, the ground was still sodden. Knowing only too well what could happen to armies attempting to fight battles in mud, Napoleon delayed for several hours to give time for the battlefield to dry out. That delay, understandable in itself, proved fatal to his hopes.
Had Napoleon attacked at first light, there is not the slightest doubt that the Duke of Wellington would have been defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. His army would have been smashed to pieces by Bonaparte's far more effective French army. The Duke of Wellington may actually have been able to retreat to Brussels. This was his plan. He may well have been forced to evacuate the continent. But it's also possible that the Duke of Wellington actually might have fallen into French hands and been taken back to Paris as Napoleon's prisoner.
If you asked me whether I would bet on Napoleon, I'd say absolutely I would, but I'd get a point spread. Napoleon is very good at dealing with a whole variety of situations. Before Waterloo, he knows what he wants to do. He knows how he's going to do it. And the rain changes the situation for him. The rain makes Napoleon want to delay a bit, in particular to ensure that his artillery performs up to par. On a wet field, not only is it hard in the rain to make the guns go bang, but also on a wet field, the cannonballs tend to squish into the ground instead of bouncing and causing more damage, because even on the bounce, a cannonball can cause terrific damage. And Napoleon had more guns than the Allies at Waterloo, and the rain meant that, and the soaked ground meant that, Napoleon's guns would have been less effective. His advantage of artillery would have been partly negated.
Unknown to Napoleon, the French Field Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy, who had been ordered to find and engage Blucher's Prussians, was still searching for them. The Prussians, in fact, were already moving westwards towards Waterloo when the rainstorm brought the French to a halt. Had Napoleon attacked Wellington at Waterloo on the 17th of June, or even early on the 18th of June, despite the wet conditions, von Blücher might never have got there in time to save his British ally. As it was, Napoleon did not attack until midday on the 18th. The French, like the British, had been thoroughly soaked by the rain. It was difficult for them to keep their gunpowder dry, and their damp woolen uniforms itched intolerably. Nevertheless, within 4 hours they were pushing the British back all along the line, and the French cavalry were about to charge Wellington Centre. At that moment, Blücher's 61,000 Prussians arrived on Napoleon's right flank. The French were now outnumbered almost 2 to 1, and their hold-on victory, which had seemed a foregone conclusion, was slipping. All the same, at 1800 hours, the infantry of the Imperial Guard, supported by artillery but without cavalry, attempted to crack the British centre. They failed. Then Wellington counterattacked. The Battle of Waterloo ended just over 2 hours later, at around 20:15 hours, with the French in full retreat, a disorganized mass of refugees pursued through the night by the victorious Prussians.
Wellington said at the end of the battle, it was a close-run thing. A few drops of rain, a little bit of moisture on the ground aren't what make the difference in the Battle of Waterloo. They help make a difference in the Battle of Waterloo, but it's not the whole difference.
3 days afterwards, Napoleon abdicated for a second time and spent the rest of his life a prisoner on the Atlantic island of St. Helena. No military leader in any age could afford adverse weather conditions. But by the 20th century, this problem had become much more serious than ever before. By then, warfare had burst all previous bounds. With the ever-increasing power of weapons, new ways of waging war over greater distances, the use of aircraft, tanks, submarines and amphibious forces, and the enormous size of the armies or navies involved. In this context, it was very fortunate that by the 19th century, weather forecasting had come to the fore as a science. The catalyst here had been the development of suitable measuring instruments, which began with the invention of the mercury barometer in Italy before 1647. There was, of course, a great deal still to be discovered, but over the next 200 years or so, scientific breakthroughs in understanding the makeup and behavior of the atmosphere led to forecasts that were much better informed than ever before.
After Torricelli invented the barometer, gradually the ideas came about that pressure fell when rain is threatening and pressure rises when the storm is past, and if the pressure is rising quickly, then it's quite likely that strong winds will come about. Now we would interpret that as because the pressure is rising quickly, the isobars are close together and they're moving across. So you've got isobars are close together, the winds are strong. So the general feeling for the relationship between pressure and weather emerged quite quickly. By 1738, they'd got fair, changeable, stormy on the barometers, for example.
In the later stages of the Second World War, at least two enterprises of cardinal importance hung on the behavior of the weather, and so made forecasting a pivotal factor in deciding failure or success. Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings in Normandy, launched from southern England across that notoriously volatile waterway, the English Channel, engaged the greatest amphibious force ever assembled for war in all of military history. There were around 5,000 ships going into action on the first day, comprising landing craft, troop transports, cargo ships, coasters, minesweepers, and some 900 warships and midget submarines that would guide the assault craft onto the Normandy beaches. A total of 154,000 American, British, and Canadian soldiers were involved, with 23,000 of them landing in northern France by parachute and glider. A massive air operation was set up to back up the invasion, including 13,000 American aircraft, over 4,500 of them big bombers. However, the fate of all these men and their material depended on the weather prevailing over the English Channel on invasion day. This narrow waterway had a well-deserved reputation for violent storms, rain squalls, and treacherous tides that had already defied invasions of England attempted by Julius Caesar, Napoleon, and Adolf Hitler, among others. The weather had to be right if Overlord were not to meet a similar fate. On the 8th of May 1944, the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, chose a date just over 4 weeks ahead as the day of the invasion, the 5th of June. On the 29th of May, Group Captain James Stagg of the Royal Air Force, Eisenhower's chief meteorologist, drew up an optimistic forecast for the first week in June. And until the 2nd of June, with only 3 days remaining, it looked as if it would be all systems go on Eisenhower's chosen day. But the Channel weather had other ideas. Late on the 3rd of June, Group Captain Stagg reported that the prospects had changed. The 5th would be overcast and rainy, with high winds and a cloud base 500 feet to zero that was far too low for air operations. Stagg could promise nothing better for the next few days either. The weather was so unsettled that predicting 24 hours ahead was as much as he dared to do. Even so, Stagg held out for some hope on the 6th of June, but his forecast was so tentative that Eisenhower had to make a command decision on whether the invasion would go in or not. Even as he pondered this dilemma, Eisenhower's command trailer was being buffeted by wind and hour upon hour of rain, with slate-gray skies looming overhead. It was hardly the flaming June of British weather lore.
If if we look at June 1944 and we see this stormy period that was around the time of D-Day, and indeed for the period when D-Day might have been a fortnight later, you might think that somehow this was abnormal, but it's part of the normal variability of weather in this part of the world. And I don't think you have to look for any special causes. I think what's happening is that the events are of great significance, and then we look at the weather associated with those events. We don't look at the weather for all the other times.
Eisenhower had to consider the Channel tides, which would not be favourable again for nearly a fortnight after the 6th of June. Already, ships sailing from Oban in Scotland on the 31st of May, carrying amphibious bridges for the invasion, had to be brought back to port. If the invasion did not go in on the 6th of June, then more ships would have to be recalled and refueled, and the troops disembarked. That could mean a lowering of combat readiness and problems with morale and security. Fortunately, on Sunday, the 4th of June, Stagg had rather better news for Eisenhower. On Monday, the 5th of June, a new weather front was going to move up the Channel, bringing clearer weather that should last until the morning of Tuesday, the 6th. It would stop raining at last, the winds would lessen, and cloud cover would rise. However, there were potential snags. It would still be cloudy, which meant a reduction in the daylight, and the better weather on Tuesday morning was likely to last no more than 2 or 3 hours. But as Eisenhower himself put it, the question is just how long can you hang this operation on the end of a limb and let it stay there? He decided to take the chance and gave the order for the Armada to set out.
I think he was a courageous man of supreme judgment. He had expert meteorological advice. He had the best brains available to him. He had trained himself and his commanders to listen to that advice. He had done this twice before, in the invasion of North Africa and the invasion of Sicily. He'd had meteorologists at his elbow. Almost always the problem had been the relationship between the wind and the state of sea, getting the landing craft ashore. And in each occasion, he had gone when many of his people thought that these conditions were unsuitable, too rough. And in each occasion he achieved surprise because the enemy thought it was too rough as well. So, yes, he took a chance because weather forecasting was not and still is not an exact science. There are too many possibilities to get it absolutely right every time. But nevertheless, it was a very professional, sound and courageous judgment, I think.
Minutes after midnight on the 6th of June 1944, Allied airborne troops were already landing in France. And by 18:30 hours, the first American troops had crossed the choppy Channel waters and were coming ashore. The resistance they met was ferocious, and Omaha Beach, the American landing site, became a slaughtering ground for GIs. But essentially, the Germans had been taken by surprise. Much of this was due to an elaborate campaign of deception by the Allies, which had successfully masked the true site of the D-Day invasion in Normandy. But a great deal of the shock the Germans received on D-Day, the 6th of June, was also due to their own differing interpretations of the weather conditions, and with that, their assessment of what Eisenhower might or might not do.
You can make your own luck, and good generals take good meteorological advice both at the planning stage and at the operational strategic stage, and at lower ranks, the day-to-day tactical information as well.
The Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, considered that a successful invasion of Europe would require at least 5 successive days of favourable weather, and June 1944 was obviously not going to come up with that. The Wehrmacht appeared divided as to whether the improved conditions early on the 6th of June would or would not favour an Allied invasion. After all, rain, storm and high winds were still hanging around the Channel area and might or might not hold off. Ultimately, though, the Germans were persuaded that the Allied invaders were not coming. In these circumstances, it could be said that weather and forecasting it had become a weapon of war in itself. The ultimate aim of the Normandy invasion of 1944 was, of course, the invasion and conquest of Nazi Germany itself. In order to do that, Allied forces had to cross the River Rhine, the 820-mile-long waterway that flowed from the Alps to the North Sea, through one of Europe's most highly industrialized and densely populated areas. The Rhine had the potential to protect Germany from invasion, just as the English Channel protected Britain, and would do so because of rain. Particularly heavy spring rains, combined with the melting of alpine snows, would raise the level of the river by as much as 25 feet. It would flood adjacent areas, and so provide a crucial obstacle to armies attempting to cross. This worst-case scenario became an important factor when planning began for the crossing of the Rhine that was to take place in the spring of 1945. To handle the possible problem of a Rhine overflowing with excessive rainwater, SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, set up the Rhine Flood Prediction Service. Undue rain was not the only question the service had to consider. It was possible that the Germans would add their own contribution by blowing up the dams upriver. If that occurred while the Allied forces were crossing, the Rhine would rise to critical levels within a very short time. Flood prediction on the Rhine followed several lines of inquiry. Weather conditions along the river were monitored daily. Rainfall was studied over an even greater area, the area already occupied by the Allies after D-Day, and the estimated rainfall in adjacent German-held territory. Interpretations were made of weather reports sent in by the Allied armies as they approached the Rhine. The Prediction Service also studied the meteorological history of the Rhine region and the records kept in the past. These studies proved all the more valuable because the winter of 1944 to 1945 produced even heavier rains than normal, with severe flooding along several reaches of the river. This was exactly the situation the service had been designed to combat. By the spring of 1945, staff of the flood prediction had become experts on the flood potential of the Rhine and could not only predict what the river would do several days in advance, but what would happen if the Germans destroyed the bridges. The first Allied forces into Germany crossed the Rhine by the bridge at Remagen on the 7th of March, 1945. As fate would have it, the weather was favorable, and the river levels were appreciably lower than they had been in spring for some time. The Germans, what is more, left the upper Rhine dams intact. Nevertheless, the work of the Flood Prediction Service showed what had to be done in the age of modern mechanized warfare, and how much expertise was needed to cope with the chance of too much rainfall and its aftermath. By the time the Rhine had been crossed, the troubled Allied campaign in Italy had already provided examples of the problems caused by heavy rain and flooding rivers. Italy was, in any case, an invader's nightmare, with ranges of mountains and river valleys along its entire length. This made the campaign in Italy into an obstacle race. As the Allies soon discovered, once they had overcome fierce German resistance along one range of mountains, yet another faced them across the intervening plain. And with any of them, the rain could mean a river in flood. After the initial Allied invasion at Salerno on the 9th of September 1943, the annual rains that began 3 weeks later greatly complicated the advance from the beachhead.
The topography of Italy is that the boot of Italy, there is a mountain chain that runs right down the middle, and that means that there are watersheds in either direction. And that means that as you move northward through Italy, you cross a mountain-fed, rapidly flowing river every 30 to 50 kilometers, a significant one. And that means that if you get a lot of rain, these rivers can be very difficult to cross. They're very significant natural barriers.
The rains were unusually heavy in 1943, and the flat coastal plain soon became flooded, marshy terrain where mobility was critically reduced. The commander of the U.S. 6th Corps, Major General John P. Lucas, wrote on the 8th of October, "Rain, rain, rain. The roads all so deep in mud that moving troops and supplies forward is a terrific job. Enemy resistance is not nearly as great as that of Mother Nature." It got worse. The Salerno invasion had taken place relatively late in the year. Winter soon arrived, bringing intense cold, fog, and virtually incessant rain.
In the summer, movement around southern Italy is not too difficult. There are deep gorges. You can actually move quite large numbers of men and vehicles through the passes in the Apennine Mountains. But from the autumn onwards, the weather changes. It rains, and it rains very heavily. And the roads are converted to mud, and indeed, very quickly the roads become watercourses. And so the climate of southern Italy is not conducive to rapid movement.
The Allied troops already had to cope with the rock-strewn landscape and insufficient or non-existent shelter, blankets and hot food. The rain simply increased their discomfort. To make matters worse, if that were possible, the Germans, expertly led by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, were fighting what was probably the most skillful defensive campaign of the entire war. All this kept the Allies trapped in the wet, inhospitable conditions for even longer than could have been expected. The Allied Fifth Army had no option but to slug it out, pushing forward with agonizing slowness, until they came to the mountaintop monastery of Monte Cassino, 87 miles southeast of Rome, early in 1944. There, the Allies came to a halt. The weather was foul, with lashing rain and bitter cold. The nearby Rapido River was in flood. Vehicles were unable to move.
The Rapido River, which Fifth Army is trying to cross as they're trying to move north, is 20 meters wide and 3 meters deep, and it's moving at 15 kilometers an hour. The Rapido River is well named. It is mucho rapido. And it is very difficult to get men and equipment across this river. You cannot ford it, you must bridge it. And yet it's 20 meters wide, it's difficult to bridge. And it is easy to defend rivers that are this difficult to cross.
The monastery assumed the proportions of a fortress, which was why it was bombed to ruins on the 15th of February 1944, on the premise that the Germans were using it to aid the defense of the Gustav Line, their series of fortified positions in southern Italy. The Germans had no interest in the monastery while it still stood intact, but after the Allied raid, they moved in among the piles of rubble. Already the pressure on the Allied forces at Monte Cassino had become so great that a relief invasion by Major Lucas's 6th Corps was planned at Anzio, around 75 miles westwards on the coast of the Tyrrhenian Sea, and 100 miles behind the German defense lines. 6th Corps went ashore at Anzio on the 22nd of January 1944, meeting only light opposition. The ultimate intention was the capture of Rome, but the first objective was to force the Germans to retreat from the Gustav Line. However, attempts to get across the Rapido River proved futile, for after 3 months of heavy rain it was in full, surging flood. The Gustav Line held out for the rest of the winter, and the Allies at Anzio, like those at Cassino, became bogged down in deadly stalemate. It was not until May 1944 that the Gustav Line finally cracked and the way to Rome lay open. The Italian capital fell to the Allies on the 4th of June. In Italy, a military commander's worst nightmare came true for General Mark Clark, American commander of the Fifth Army, when his troops were forced to fight against a determined enemy in inhospitable conditions at the wrong time of year. Though detail and locale were quite different, General William Slim, Uncle Bill as he was known to his admiring troops, suffered a similar experience in Burma in 1942, when the British were thrashed to defeat and retreat by the rampant forces of the Empire of Japan. The Japanese were already in Burma by the 11th of December 1941, only 4 days after their attack on Pearl Harbor had shocked the United States into the Second World War. Within 4 months, in Burma, they were fighting their way through jungle terrain generally thought to be impenetrable and smashing British resistance on all fronts. Somehow, or as skeptics said, by some miracle, the British had to extricate their troops.
Slim looked at the options, and one option was getting out of Burma before the monsoons and then fighting his way back into Burma. And the other option was to try to join up with the Chinese by extracting into China and join up with the Americans as well and try to come out that way. All of the other options were worse than the option of pulling back before the monsoon.
He knew that he could withdraw his army deep into Burma. His predecessor, General Hutton, had actually established bases running all the way up the Irrawaddy and really all the way up to the Chindwin. And so it was possible to fall back on these logistic depots, these bases, and keep his army intact. However, beyond the Chindwin, there was a range of mountains, jungle-clad, dreadfully malarial, and there was no direct line of communication to India.
On the 11th of April, General Slim, in command of the 14th Army, received the order to withdraw to India. The timing could not have been worse. The monsoon rains would soon break, soaking everything: the ground, the trees, the men, their weapons and equipment, their clothes, their bedding, their food. Slim was, in fact, being forced to embark on this epic of mass escape at the most grueling time of the year. The Burmese jungle in April and May was at its sweatiest, thirstiest, most fly-infested, and most enervating.
It's in a monsoon region, but above all, it's mountainous and there is a warm ocean close by. So every time the wind blows off the ocean, it's got lots of water vapour in it. The water vapour is forced up over the mountains if there's any wind at all, or indeed if the sun is shining, as it will be doing on the mountains, so that you get shower cloud convection. And the combination makes it a humid, rainy place.
That you get the first few fat drops, and then it is as if a million high-pressure hoses have opened up. It's not like standing in rain where there are drops of rain hitting you in England or in Europe. No, this is a different kind of rain. It is as though someone is standing in the sky above you, dumping buckets of water onto you. The ground does not absorb the water at first, and there is actually a thick film of water on the ground. There is standing water all over, not just in puddles. The whole ground is covered with water. If you're sleeping on the ground, you're sleeping in water.
There are no specific health risks from the rain itself, but with stagnant water and the risks of pollution, then there are certainly disease risks associated with that. In hot environments as well, or malarial environments, stagnant water is an ideal breeding ground for malarial insects.
Slim's forces, made up of British, Indian and Gurkha soldiers, crossed the Irrawaddy River heading for Assam in eastern India. The roads were choked with refugees. The Japanese were in pursuit and outflanked Slim's army several times. Then on the 12th of May, the monsoon broke and the Japanese advance was halted. At the same time, the full misery of day upon day and night after night of perpetual rain was unleashed. Before long, Slim's men were wet through, caked in mud and chilled to the bone. From then on, for the 5.5 months their retreat lasted, Slim's men hardly knew what it was to be dry. Slim himself described what it was like. Ploughing their way up slopes over a track inches deep in slippery mud soaked to the skin, rotten with fever, ill-fed and shivering as the air grew cooler, the troops went on hour after hour, day after day. Their only rest at night was to lie on the sodden ground under the dripping trees, without even a blanket to cover them. When at last they reached India, over those terrible jungle mountains, the army of Burma sank down on the frontier of India, dead beat and in rags. Not all of them made it, though. The retreat from Burma cost 10,036 lives, and Slim himself admitted that the monsoon had almost destroyed his army. But 2 years later, Slim and a new revitalized 14th Army were back in Burma, kicking the Japanese back to Rangoon, as the general put it. By the 3rd of May 1945, when Rangoon was captured, the war in Burma was virtually at an end. And this time it was all over before that year's monsoon arrived and the rains began.
In war, as in many other complex situations, the outcome is influenced by cascades of events. X happens, Y happens, Z happens, and because of the interaction of all of these influences, you get an outcome. So, can rain be part of an event cascade that results in a certain outcome? Yes, it can. Is rain the only thing? You can never say that anything is the only thing that creates an outcome in war.